of the few territories not abandoned by Hadrian when he came to power a decade later. Taken and held mostly so that the Romans could control all the trade routes into the Mediterranean, Arabia wound up a surprisingly stable province and was a loyal and lucrative corner of the empire well into the Byzantine Age. Its single legion was famous for refusing to back eastern pretenders to the throne like Avidius Cassius and Pescennius Niger, instead choosing to remain loyal to whoever ruled in Rome. Polar opposite of loyal Arabia was its northwestern neighbor, the once vigorously rebellious Judea, but now the utterly depopulated and weak Palestinia. I kind of feel like we've already spent enough time on this rebellious little province that never seemed particularly rich enough or important enough to have been the source of so much trouble. Their primary exports wound up being slaves and refugees fleeing for their lives. North of Judea-Palestinia was Syria, the key province of the Eastern Roman Empire. Conquered and organized by Pompey as he went east young man in the 60s BC, it housed 3 and sometimes 4 standing legions, and was the main staging point for all operations against the Parthians, with whom this critical territory shared a border. The provincial capital of Antioch became a hugely important urban center, and was the de facto capital of the Roman East. Complementing its rigid defense against incoming eastern armies, Syria simultaneously embraced all the incoming trade from the east, and became a decadent and wealthy middleman, acting as the overland terminus of the famous Silk Road coming in from China. Proper Romans, though, forever held Syria up as the example of everything that was wrong with exposing Rome to eastern temptations. The legions stationed there were constantly accused of showing lax discipline, and the soldiers castigated for constantly going native amidst a population more than willing to corrupt their supposed masters. But despite its reputation for loose morals, no one could deny that without Syria, the empire would have been far less rich and far less powerful than it had become. The imports and exports that passed through and originated from its borders generated the gold and supplies that allowed Roman power to explode exponentially following Pompey's annexation. Round the bend from Syria were the provinces of Anatolia. Directly bordering Syria were Cilicia, which hugged the Mediterranean coast, and Cappadocia, which headed up into the Taurus Mountains. Cappadocia was an imperial province that, thanks to its shared border with Armenia and Greater Mesopotamia, wound up housing 2 legions. The province that would become best known for its series of underground cities is, to me anyway, best known as the province that always backed the wrong side in a war, yet still managed to escape major reprisals. The Cappadocians backed first Antiochus against the Romans, then Mithridates against the Romans, then Pompey against Julius Caesar, then Brutus and Cassius against the Second Triumvirate, then Antony against Octavian. In every case they lost, and yet somehow managed to ingratiate themselves enough with the winner that they were ever after accepted as loyal allies of the victors. I would guess, though, that the 2 legions now stationed in their backyard was promise enough of their loyalty. To the south was Cilicia, a senatorial province that needed no legions. Combined administratively with the island of Cyprus, Cilicia was most famous for its rugged western half being a haven for pirates, until Pompey burned all their ships and turned the erstwhile brigands into fouler-mouthed than average farmers. But the eastern half of Cilicia was composed of rich flats that produced millet, olives, and sesame, in addition to providing excellent pasture land for substantial herds of goats and cattle. West of Cilicia was Lycia Pamphylia. It was also a Roman province. West of Cappadocia and northwest of Cilicia was the unimpressive but still unique province of Galatia, which literally translates as Gaul of the East. It was known by this seemingly out-of-place name because the territory, mostly high plateau, had been settled by a group of migrating Gauls in the 280s BC. They retained their semi-nomadic pastoral lifestyle and enriched themselves by launching periodic raids on the richer kingdoms surrounding them. The Galatians initially joined with Antiochus and then Mithridates as they attempted to resist Roman expansion, but by the end of Sulla's eastern campaign, they had attached themselves firmly to the Roman cause and remained a loyal and nominally independent client kingdom until the last Galatian king died in 25 BC, just as Augustus was defining the new imperial political order. Galatia was annexed and claimed by the emperor as one of his new imperial provinces. Thereafter, it was a provincial backwater, best known for the fact that, because it was a provincial backwater, early Christianity was able to flourish there relatively unmolested by the Roman authorities. North of Galatia and Cappadocia were the often combined provinces of Bithynia and Pontus, which together ran the length of the southern Black Sea coast. The rich valleys of Pontus had been the home of some of Rome's fiercest enemies during the 1st and 2nd centuries BC, but by the age of the Antonines, all such resistance was dead, and the locals contented themselves as tradesmen, farmers, and as particularly good iron and steel smiths. Their sister province of Bithynia had the good fortune of being located at the crossroads of Asia and Europe, leading its urban centers along the Sea of Marmara to become rich and important trading powers. The Bithynian interior was rugged and forested, and the locals liked to boast that they were one of the few places on Earth that Alexander had been unable to conquer outright. The Macedonian king had instead decided to simply keep moving when the fierce locals took to the mountains, rather than bog his army down in a protracted siege of the dense, steep countryside. The province, then a client kingdom, also wound up being a thorn in Julius Caesar's side, as he was dogged for years by rumors that he had gone to bed as the passive partner with the king of Bithynia. You'll recall that his enemies often scribbled graffiti on the walls of Rome. Bithynia Pontus was also the corrupt and disorganized province that Trajan had sent Pliny the Younger to straighten out in the early 100s AD, a difficult task that at best produced mixed results. The rest of the west coast of Anatolia was swallowed by the province of Asia, a senatorial province that had been brought into the empire following the death of King Attalus of Pergamum in 129 BC. His kingdom had been created as a buffer client state following the withdrawal of Antiochus in 190 BC, and, with no male heirs, Attalus simply left the kingdom to Rome in his will. This territorial windfall was a political windfall in particular for Gaius Gracchus, who argued forcefully, and then violently, that Asia ought to be carved up democratically, rather than being handed over to a couple of rich patricians. After years of indifferent Roman rule, Mithridates invaded and slaughtered every Roman he could find in the Asiatic Vespers of 88 BC, prompting Sulla to take revenge and reclaim the territory for Rome, in whose sphere of influence it remained until the fall of the Byzantine Empire. Asia was characterized most especially by its decentralized political structure. Dozens of coastal Greek colonies, each more ancient and storied than the last, vied with each other for prominence and refused to let any of the others gain the upper hand. In their race to secure the emperor's favor, Asia wound up being the first territory to really embrace the practice of worshipping the cult of the Caesars, and emperor worship became deeper and wider spread in Asia than just about anywhere else in the empire. Across the Hellespont from Asia was Thracia, supposed homeland of everyone's favorite gladiator Spartacus. The land between Macedonia and the Sea of Marmara had been one of Rome's undefined holdings that was annexed officially by Claudius as he and his ministers attempted to make the empire run more rationally. The rugged country was known for its disparate local tribes who seemed to hate each other more than they hated the Romans. Down the road, the province will produce a number of notable soldier emperors, including the beast Maximinius Thrax, whose assassination of Alexander Severus helped spark the crisis of the 3rd century, and Constantine's great colleagues/rivals Galerius and Licinius, whose demise helped close the door on that particular century of chaos. North of Thracia was the province of Moesia, eventually divided by Domitian into upper and lower halves to make the whole territory more militarily agile. The superior and inferior in this case referring to the downhill path of the Danube rather than the Rhine. The country had been finally conquered by the grandson of Marcus Crassus around 29 BC, but it was not organized as a province until at least 6 AD. Located on the south bank of the Danube, Moesia became one of the keys to the whole Roman defensive strategy, and 4 legions were stationed there permanently, 2 each in the upper and lower sections. Its strategic military value was never in doubt, though its responsibilities were lightened somewhat by Trajan's conquest of Dacia in 105, which pushed the northern border across the Danube and left Upper Moesia at least an interior province. Beyond its military value, Moesia also came equipped with gold fields in the west and excellent farmland in the east, and obviously, its location along the Danube left it in control of most of the international trade coming down that great river, making Moesia rich, which was nice, but also leaving it the constant target of envious Germans on the north bank, which wasn't so nice. This was why the locals in Moesia were enthusiastic supporters of Trajan's Dacian conquest, and hoped for more where that came from. They would be let down by Hadrian, though, and Dacia would be the last major province added to the empire and the only Roman territory on the far side of the Danube. Its abundant mineral resources, especially in the gold and silver department, gave the Roman economy a much-needed shot in the arm, though it proved to be a tenuously held territory at best. Hadrian had wanted to withdraw, but was compelled by economic and political necessity to retain what he considered an indefensible position. The money flowing in was nice, though, and while it lasted, Dacia was a key cog in the imperial minting machine. The province would eventually be split into upper and lower departments by Hadrian after he determined he could not just let go of the province altogether, and at some point, during either his reign or Antoninus's, a third province was spun off, leading the Romans to call them all collectively the Three Dacias. Among the last territories added to the empire, Dacia was also one of the first to be abandoned, and it was left to its fate by Aurelian in 275 AD, though pointedly only after he had decisively beaten the Goths in battle and killed their leader. South of Moesia was the cradle of Greek civilization, now called Macedonia and Achaia. Finally conquered by the Romans during the Third Macedonian War in 146 BC, the exhausted Greeks were forced to give up their independence and accept foreign rule. Out of respect for the great and ancient civilization they had just defeated, and which they admired so much, Rome pretty much left the cities of Greece free to govern themselves. Macedonia was obviously harder hit by the last war than the cities around the Peloponnese, and for a while it limped along a depopulated mess. But with the construction of the Via Egnatia, a major Roman road from Dyrrhachium to the Hellespont, it was revitalized and rode its booming business in trade and travel back to prominence. Achaia, meanwhile, less chastened by the Macedonian Wars, tried to hold on to its independence more forcefully than their northern neighbors. Believing themselves simply better than the barbarian Romans, the Greeks of Athens and Sparta treated their new overlords with barely concealed contempt. When Mithridates came calling in the 80s BC, promising to lead the whole of the East to freedom, the Greek elites readily agreed to help out. Sulla made them pay for their defiance and famously sacked Athens in brutal fashion in 87 BC. Thereafter, the chastened Greeks, while still feeling superior, were far less inclined to act on their contempt. Languished as a fallen backwater. Athens retained its traditional status as a cultural center, but it had long been eclipsed by Alexandria as the cultural center of the Mediterranean.